There was a moment, and you remember it clearly, when you believed it was going to work. You had found the method, the practice, the framework that finally seemed to make sense of why your life had felt stuck, why your desires kept slipping through your fingers, why you kept arriving at the same disappointments, no matter how hard you tried. Someone told you that the problem was your thinking, that if you could just shift your mindset, speak the right words, hold the right images in your mind long enough, reality would reorganize itself around your intentions. And for a brief window of time, that idea felt like the most liberating thing you had ever heard. You started the affirmations. You wrote them on mirrors, in journals, on small cards you kept in your wallet. I am worthy of love I earned, and I attract what I desire. Everything is working out for me. You said them with conviction. You said them when you didn't believe them, because you were told that was the point, that repetition would eventually override the doubt. You visualized. You created vision boards. You meditated on the feelings of already having what you wanted. You did the work, or at least the work you were told to do. And something happened. There was a brief surge of hope, a lightness, a feeling that maybe this time would be different. But the results did not come, or they came partially and then collapsed. Or they came in one area, while another area of your life deteriorated in ways you couldn't explain. The relationship you manifested turned out to carry the same wounds as the ones before it. The money you attracted disappeared in ways that felt almost deliberate. The confidence you built in the morning dissolved by afternoon when the familiar heaviness returned. And slowly, quietly, you began to suspect something that felt almost shameful to admit, that you were doing it wrong, that you weren't believing hard enough, that some deficiency inside you was sabotaging the process. What no one told you, what the entire industry of positive thinking carefully avoids, is that affirmations and the law of attraction operate only on the surface layer of the mind. They speak to the conscious self, the part of you that sets intentions, makes plans, chooses words, and holds images. But beneath that conscious surface lives another layer entirely. A layer that is older, denser, and far more powerful than any affirmation you have ever spoken. Carl Jung called this layer the unconscious. And within the unconscious lives a structure that will silently dismantle everything your conscious mind attempts to build, unless you learn to work with it. That structure is the shadow. This video is not about destroying your belief in growth or change. It is about giving you something far more valuable than a technique. It is about telling you the truth. The truth about why some people transform and others repeat. The truth about why genuine change feels so different from positive thinking. And the truth about what it actually takes to align your inner world deeply enough that your outer world begins to shift, not through affirmations, but through integration. The journey begins with understanding why the tools you were given were never designed to reach far enough. To understand why affirmations fail at the deepest level, you first need a map of the psyche that is more accurate than the one most people carry. The popular model is simple. You have a conscious mind that thinks and chooses, and a subconscious mind that stores habits and beliefs. Change the beliefs in the subconscious through repetition, visualization, or positive programming, and your life will change accordingly. This model is not entirely wrong, but it is dangerously incomplete. It describes only the upper levels of the inner world, leaving the most powerful layer unnamed and unaddressed. Carl Jung proposed a different and far more complex map. The conscious mind, he observed, is only a small illuminated circle floating on a vast, dark ocean. Just beneath the surface lies the personal unconscious, the layer that contains repressed memories, forgotten experiences, unprocessed emotions, and beliefs formed in childhood before language gave us the tools to examine them. This is the layer that positive psychology targets. And targeting it is not useless, but it is insufficient. Because beneath the personal unconscious lies something deeper still, the collective unconscious. A layer shared across humanity, containing archetypal patterns that predate individual experience entirely. Within the personal unconscious, Jung identified a specific structure he called the shadow. The shadow is not simply your negative thoughts or limiting beliefs, though it contains those. It is the repository of everything you have rejected about yourself. Everything that was shamed, punished, denied, or made unwelcome in the process of becoming the person you learned you needed to be. The parts of you that expressed anger and were told that anger was unacceptable. The parts that wanted rest and were told that rest was laziness. The parts that felt grief, fear, inadequacy, rage, hunger, sexuality, ambition, or neediness, and learned to hide those parts so effectively that you eventually forgot they were there. The shadow does not disappear when you learn to suppress it. It goes underground. It operates below the threshold of conscious awareness, shaping your perceptions, driving your reactions, influencing your choices in ways that feel like fate rather than psychology. When you fall into the same relationship pattern for the 5th time and cannot understand why, the shadow is active. When you self-sabotage at the edge of success in ways that deceiving, the shadow is active. When you feel an inexplicable resistance to the very things you consciously say you want, the shadow is not being difficult. It is being honest about something your conscious mind refuses to see. This is the architecture that affirmations never reach. When you stand in front of a mirror and repeat, "I am worthy," your conscious mind hears the words and momentarily believes them. But the shadow, which holds decades of experience that proved the opposite, moments of abandonment, rejection, humiliation, invisibility, does not update its records based on a morning ritual. It has evidence. It has history. It has a logic that was built from lived experience, and it will not be overwritten by repetition alone. To transform at this level requires something entirely different from positive thinking. It requires dissent. Imagine standing at the edge of a dark forest, speaking loudly into the trees. Everything is working out. I am safe. Abundant. The universe supports me. The words echo clearly in the open air. But inside the forest, something is listening that has its own understanding of what safety means, what abundance costs, and what the universe has historically delivered. That something is the shadow. And its disagreement is not irrational. It is deeply, disturbingly rational, based on a different set of data than your affirmations are drawing from. The shadow disagrees because it remembers what you have chosen to forget. It remembers the time you trusted and were betrayed. The time you wanted something desperately and lost it. The time you were told your needs were too much. Your feelings were wrong. Your desires were selfish or dangerous or delusional. These experiences created what Jung called complexes, emotional clusters organized around a wound, each with their own logic, their own voice, their own agenda. When you affirm abundance, the complex around scarcity activates. You said that before. You believed it before. Here is what happened. The complex does not want to hurt you. It wants to protect you from the specific pain that created it. The shadow also disagrees because it carries the disowned parts of your desire. This is less obvious, but equally important. When you affirm that you want love, the shadow may hold a part of you that is furious at the people who were supposed to love you and didn't. When you affirm financial abundance, the shadow may hold a part of you that associates money with corruption, with becoming someone you despise, with losing the identity of the person who struggles nobly. When you affirm health, the shadow may hold a part of you that discovered illness was the only time you were allowed to rest without guilt. These contradictions are not weakness. They are the accumulated logic of a life. There is also a deeper layer of disagreement that touches the question of identity. The conscious self that performs affirmations has a particular self-image, someone who is growing, healing, becoming. But the shadow holds an older identity, one formed before you had the language or the power to question it. If that older identity was built around unworthiness, invisibility, or chronic struggle, then success, love, and abundance represent not liberation but existential threat. To become someone who is what they want would require becoming someone unfamiliar. And the psyche, like the body, resists foreign to. What looks like self-sabotage from the outside is, from the inside, a profound act of self-preservation. This is why the most sincere, most disciplined practitioners of positive thinking often remain stuck in the most baffling ways. They are not lacking in belief. They are not lacking in effort. They are lacking in depth. They are working on the top floor of a building whose foundation is cracked, and no amount of renovation upstairs changes what is happening in the basement. The shadow is not your enemy. It is the part of you that has been doing the most honest work, holding everything that was too heavy, too dangerous, too complicated for the surface self to carry. Until that part is met with understanding rather than suppression, it will continue to disagree. Loudly, persistently, and effectively. Every desire has a history. When you trace a persistent wanting back far enough, past the vision boards and the goal setting and the conscious intentions, you eventually arrive at a wound. Not always a dramatic one. Not always something that would look significant from the outside. Sometimes it is something as quiet as a parent who was emotionally unavailable, a teacher who dismissed your intelligence, a sibling whose needs consistently eclipsed your own, a childhood home where love was conditional in ways no one ever stated explicitly, but everyone clearly understood. These early experiences do not just shape your beliefs. They shape the emotional vocabulary through which you interpret every subsequent experience. The wound beneath the wanting is the reason you want what you want in the way that you want it. You don't simply want love. You want the specific quality of love that was withheld, offered inconsistently, or given in ways that confused it with control. You don't simply want success. You want the particular kind of recognition that would finally prove something to someone who probably isn't watching anymore. The want is real. The desire is genuine. But it is also layered with older hungers that have nothing to do with the present moment and everything to do with an unresolved past. When affirmations reach this layer, they don't heal it, they bypass it. And bypassing a wound does not make it inactive, it makes it invisible, which is far more dangerous. A wound you cannot see is a wound that operates without oversight. It influences your choices without your awareness. It creates a gravitational pull toward situations that will reactivate its original pain. Because the psyche, in its strange and persistent wisdom, keeps returning to unfinished business, hoping that this time it will be resolved differently. This is what therapists call repetition compulsion. What Jung called the unconscious need for completion. The law of attraction, at its most superficial, teaches you to focus on what you want and avoid focusing on what you don't want. But the wound doesn't care about your focus. The wound is not a thought. It is a somatic reality, a pattern held in the body, in the nervous system, in the automatic responses that activate before your conscious mind has time to intervene. When the nervous system has learned that intimacy leads to loss, no amount of visualizing a loving relationship will override that learning. The body remembers. The shadow remembers. And until that memory is metabolized through actual psychological and somatic work, it will continue to shape the reality you attract, regardless of the images you hold in your mind. This is the most compassionate reframe available. Your resistance to what you want is not evidence of your brokenness. It is evidence of your intelligence. The part of you that resists is the part that learned, through real experience, that wanting too much is dangerous, that hoping to fully leads to devastation, that being seen completely makes you vulnerable in ways you cannot afford. These were not irrational conclusions. They were survival strategies, and they served you well once. The work is not to shame them into silence. The work is to understand them deeply enough that they can finally, slowly, begin to trust that the danger they were designed to protect you from is no longer the reality you are living in. The shadow does not announce itself. It does not send a message the night before saying, tomorrow, when you are close to something good, I will intervene. It operates through mechanisms so familiar, they feel like personality rather than psychology. You recognize them as habits, as tendencies, as simply the way you are. The person who consistently arrives late to important opportunities. The person who picks fights at the moment relationships become most tender. The person who loses money reliably, in different ways, at different times, but always in the end. The person who gets sick before major milestones. These are not coincidences. They are the shadow's vocabulary. Procrastination is one of the shadow's most elegant tools. From the outside, and even from the inside, It looks like laziness, poor time management, or lack of motivation. But beneath the surface, procrastination is often a negotiation between the conscious desire to move forward and the unconscious terror of what forward movement would mean. If you finish the project, it will be judged. If you launch the business, it might fail publicly. If you complete the degree, you will have to become the person you claim to be. And what if that person is still not enough? Procrastination preserves possibility. As long as the thing is not done, it has not yet failed. The shadow understands this perfectly. Self-sabotage at the edge of success is perhaps the most confusing shadow pattern because it contradicts the conscious narrative so completely. You have worked for this. You have wanted this. And then, at the moment it arrives, or is about to arrive, something happens. A relationship ends. An opportunity is squandered through an inexplicable decision. A health crisis emerges. The timing feels almost cosmically cruel. But the shadow is not cruel, it is consistent. What it is protecting you from, at that particular threshold, is the identity shift that success requires. Becoming the person who has the thing you want means leaving behind the person who wanted it. And that older identity, however painful, is familiar. Familiarity is, to the unconscious, a form of safety. In relationships, the shadow sabotages through projection. The qualities you most disavow in yourself are the ones you will reliably find most intolerable in others. The person who has suppressed their own neediness will be driven to distraction by a partner's vulnerability. The person who has exiled their own anger will attract partners who express rage in their place. The person who has buried their own ambition will unconsciously undermine the ambitions of those they love. These are not character flaws. They are the shadow's way of pointing back at what has not yet been integrated. Every person who triggers you deeply is holding, in some form, a piece of your own disowned self. The subtlest form of shadow sabotage is the one that lives in meaning-making. When something goes wrong, the shadow is the voice that says, "See, I told you, this is what happens. This is who you are. This is what the world is." It interprets events through the lens of the original wound, confirming its own worldview with every setback. And because the mind tends to find what it is looking for, the shadow's interpretations become self-fulfilling. You expect rejection, so you read it into neutral responses. You expect failure, so you unconsciously create the conditions for it. You expect to be unseen, so you make yourself slightly invisible in every room you enter. The affirmation cannot compete with this. The affirmation is a single voice. The shadow is the entire chorus of your history. And here is what that means for every vision board you have ever made. Every morning ritual you have ever practiced. Every intention you have ever set with sincerity and hope. None of it reaches far enough. Not because you are broken, but because the instrument you were given was never designed to play that deep. Something else is required. And that something begins not with a new affirmation, but with a question you have probably been afraid to ask. You have probably felt it before, that strange moment when you understand something intellectually and yet nothing in your life changes. You read the book, you understood the concept, you nodded at the insight, and then you returned, with unsettling precision, to the exact pattern you had just finished understanding. This is the gap that Jung spent his entire life mapping, the distance between what the conscious mind knows and what the unconscious self actually does. And closing that gap, he insisted, was not a matter of better information. It was a matter of genuine encounter with what lives below the surface. Carl Jung was not opposed to the idea that the inner world shapes the outer world. In fact, his entire life's work was built on the premise that the unconscious has a profound and persistent influence on the life we create. But Jung's understanding of how that influence works and what it takes to change it was radically different from what the law of attraction proposes. For Jung, the path to genuine transformation did not run through positive thinking. It ran through what he called the confrontation with the unconscious, the willingness to descend into the parts of the self that had been avoided, denied, and suppressed. Jung observed that most people live in what he called a state of participation mystique, a kind of psychological fusion with their unconscious contents, in which they experience their inner world as outer reality without recognizing the projection. The person who believes the world is fundamentally hostile is not making a neutral observation about external reality. They are perceiving the world through the lens of an inner state that has been projected outward. The work of individuation, Jung's term for the lifelong process of becoming who you truly are, begins with recognizing this projection, with pulling back what you have placed onto the world and acknowledging it as yours. The shadow, in Jung's framework, is the first and most essential territory of this inner work. He famously wrote that the shadow is the apprentice piece, meaning it is the first major task of psychological development that must be undertaken before anything deeper can be approached. You cannot access the deeper layers of the unconscious, the anima or animus, the self, until you have begun the uncomfortable work of acknowledging what lives in the shadow. Not eradicating it, not transcending it, acknowledging it, understanding it, and ultimately integrating it into a more complete and honest self-image. Integration, in Jungian terms, does not mean becoming your shadow. It does not mean acting out your rage, indulging your most destructive impulses, or abandoning the moral framework you have built. It means recognizing that the rage exists, that the destructive impulse has an origin and a logic, that the part of you which was exiled did not disappear. It went underground and continued operating from there. When you bring it into consciousness, when you sit with it honestly and ask what it needed, what it was trying to protect, what wound it formed around, you take away its power to operate invisibly. You do not destroy the shadow by meeting it. You metabolize it. And what was once an autonomous, force-driving behavior from below becomes a known element of a more integrated whole. The positive thinking framework is built on a set of premises that feel true at the surface and become insufficient under psychological scrutiny. The first is that negative emotions are obstacles to be eliminated. In this muddle, fear, grief, anger, shame, and doubt are problems, evidence that your vibration is wrong, your mindset is broken, your energy is misaligned. The prescription is always the same: shift your focus, raise your frequency, choose better thoughts. What this does, in practice, is train people to become highly skilled at emotional suppression while calling it spiritual development. The emotions don't disappear. They migrate into the shadow, where they become more powerful precisely because they are no longer being observed. The second premise is that desire alone is enough to attract what you want. This flatters the conscious self enormously. It suggests that wanting something intensely and believing in it sincerely is a sufficient engine for change, but desire is not uniform. The conscious desire and the unconscious counter-desire often point in opposite directions. You consciously desire financial security while unconsciously associating it with the parent whose money controlled your freedom. You consciously desire a loving partnership while unconsciously expecting it to end in the specific way that hurt you most. The pull of the unconscious counter-desire is not weaker than the conscious desire. Emptier is considerably stronger because it carries more history. The third premise is perhaps the most quietly damaging, that if the practice isn't working, you aren't applying it correctly. This places the entire weight of failure on the practitioner. If your affirmations aren't producing results, you must be saying them wrong, believing insufficiently, or harboring secret negativity that contaminates the process. It becomes nearly impossible to question the method itself, because any failure can be attributed to inadequate application. It is a closed loop that keeps people working harder at a tool that was never designed to address the actual source of their stuckness and internalizing the failure as personal deficiency. The fourth premise is that your inner state influences your outer experience because the universe responds to frequency. But the psychological reality beneath this is simpler and more verifiable: your perception, your behavior, your nervous system responses, your relational patterns, and your decision-making are all shaped by your unconscious, and your unconscious shapes what you notice, what you create, and what you allow. Change the unconscious, and your reality shifts. Not Because the universe rearranged itself in response to your vibration. Because you changed the lens through which you were perceiving and creating your experience. The fifth premise is the quietest and the most worth examining. That peace is a destination reached through sustained positivity. That if you do the inner work, the affirmations, the gratitude practice, the visualization, you will arrive at a state of ease where struggle is no longer your experience. But genuine psychological peace is not the absence of difficulty. It is the presence of integration. It comes not from having eliminated the dark parts of the self, but from having met them with enough honesty and compassion that they no longer need to sabotage from the shadows. It is a peace that includes everything, not one built by excluding half of human experience and hoping the excluded half stays quiet. In virtually every mythological tradition that has survived long enough to reveal something true about the human condition, the hero does not ascend to transformation. The hero descends. Orpheus descends into the underworld. Inanna descends through 7 gates, surrendering a piece of herself at each one. Jonah descends into the whale. Dante descends through the circles of hell before he can begin the climb toward paradise. These are not stories about people who thought positively until reality cooperated. They are stories about people who went down into what was most feared and were changed not by avoiding the darkness, but by passing through it. Jung understood these myths as maps of the psyche. The descent is the confrontation with the shadow. The monsters encountered along the way are the complexes, the wounds, the exiled parts of the self. The transformation that becomes possible on the other side is not the transformation of someone who successfully maintained a positive attitude. It is the transformation of someone who was willing to know themselves completely, including the parts that were hidden, shamed, denied, and suppressed. This is individuation, not perfection, not permanent positivity, not the elimination of suffering, but the expansion of consciousness to include what was previously unconscious. The descent begins with honesty, a particular kind of honesty that is different from self-criticism or self-blame. It is the honesty of genuine curiosity. What is actually happening inside me, beneath the story I have been telling myself? When the affirmation fails, instead of redoubling the effort or blaming your vibrational frequency, you ask a different question. What part of me disagrees with this? What is the counter-narrative? Where did that counter-narrative come from? What experience taught me that this particular thing, love, abundance, safety, recognition, was not reliably available to me? These questions are not comfortable, but they are enormously more productive than any affirmation ever written. The descent also requires the development of what Jung called the transcendent function, the capacity to hold two opposites simultaneously without collapsing into one or the other. To want love and to acknowledge the terror of intimacy. To desire success and to understand the shadow sphere of the identity it would require. To affirm abundance and to sit honestly with the grief of scarcity that was real, that happened, that left its mark. This is not contradiction. This is wholeness. And it is only from this place of genuine internal complexity that change becomes sustainable, because it is built on the full reality of who you are, not on a curated version that excludes half of your experience. The practical shape of descent looks different for everyone. For some it happens in therapy, for others in dream work, which Jung considered the royal road to the unconscious. For others in creative expression, in writing, painting, or movement that bypasses the conscious mind and allows something deeper to surface. For others it happens in the body, through somatic work that addresses the places where the shadow is held not in thought, but in tissue and breath, and the automatic bracing of muscles that have been guarding old wounds for decades. There is no single method. What all genuine methods share is the willingness to go toward what is difficult rather than away from it, and to meet what is found there with curiosity rather than judgment. Integration is not a dramatic event. It does not arrive as a moment of blinding clarity in which all your wounds are healed and your shadow is permanently subdued. It arrives as a gradual shift in the quality of your inner experience, a slowly increasing capacity to be with yourself without flinching. You begin to notice the shadow's voice, without being entirely identified with it. When the familiar, internal narrative says you are going to fail at this, you can hear it as a voice rather than as the truth. You can ask where it came from. You can acknowledge its fear without obeying its instructions. This small space between stimulus and response, between the shadow's activation and your behavioral reaction, is where freedom actually lives. One of the most consistent markers of genuine integration is a change in what triggers you. Not the elimination of triggers. That is not the goal, and anyone who promises it is selling something, but a shift in their quality. The things that used to ignite disproportionate reactions begin to carry less charge. Not because you have suppressed them more effectively, but because you have understood them more completely. When you know that your rage at a partner's criticism is connected to a father who was contemptuous of your childhood efforts, the rage does not disappear, but it becomes interpretable. It becomes information rather than weather. You can work with information. You cannot work with weather. Integration also changes the nature of your desires. This is perhaps the most surprising aspect of genuine inner work. When the shadow's contradictory desires are brought into consciousness and acknowledged, the conscious desire often shifts. The desperate hunger for validation that drove your ambition may soften into a more authentic interest in the work itself. The compulsive search for a partner who will finally make you feel complete may transform into a more grounded capacity to be in relationship without using it as a mirror for your own unresolved needs. The desire becomes cleaner, less urgent, less entangled with old hungers. And paradoxically, this is often when outer circumstances begin to shift most noticeably, not because you have aligned your frequency, but because you are no longer unconsciously creating the conditions for your original wound to be re-experienced. Relationships are perhaps where integration becomes most visible. When you have genuinely done shadow work, you stop needing other people to carry your projections. You stop seeing in your partner the embodiment of everything you have denied in yourself. The person becomes more real, more three-dimensional, more separate from your inner theater. This is initially disorienting, because the projection was providing a kind of emotional intensity that felt like connection. How connection to an actual other person rather than to a projection of your own unconscious is quieter, more spacious, less cinematic, and, eventually, far more nourishing than anything the projection could offer. The integrated person is not someone without a shadow. They are someone who is in active, ongoing relationship with their shadow, who knows its shape, its history, its triggers, its logic. They are someone who has stopped trying to be only the light and has made room for the full spectrum of their humanity. This does not make them more negative. It makes them more honest. And honesty, in the Jungian sense, is the foundation of genuine power, not the performed positivity that crumbles under pressure, but the real and grounded presence of someone who knows who they are, including the parts they would rather not be, and has chosen to be that person with full awareness and full acceptance. Everything described in the previous chapter, the shift in triggers, the cleaner desire, the more honest presence points towards something that is difficult to name but unmistakable when you begin to feel it. It is not the absence of wanting. It is a different quality of wanting, one that does not grip, one that does not demand, one that is rooted in a clearer understanding of what you actually need, as opposed to what you were taught to want, what you were conditioned to chase, or what you are pursuing in the hope that achieving it will finally resolve an old emotional debt. This is where the journey of genuine transformation arrives, not at a destination, but at a different relationship with the self that desires. The answer to what you truly need is rarely found on a vision board. It is found in the places you have been avoiding, in the conversations you have been postponing, in the emotions you have been managing rather than experiencing, in the creative work you keep almost beginning, in the grief that has been waiting for a safe moment to be felt, in the anger that has been redirected into anxiety for so long that you have forgotten it is anger, in the longing that lives beneath the longing, the one that is not for a particular outcome, but for a particular quality of contact with your own life. This is what genuine transformation moves toward, not the acquisition of desired objects, but the deepening of the relationship with the self that desires. This does not mean abandoning your practical goals. It means carrying them differently. When your desire for financial security is no longer entangled with a childhood fear of scarcity, you can pursue it with a steadiness that the frantic energy of scarcity-driven ambition cannot sustain. When your desire for love is no longer contaminated by the expectation of abandonment, you can be present in a relationship rather than perpetually bracing for its end. When your desire for recognition is no longer compensating for an original invisibility, you can create work for the sake of the work itself, and often, paradoxically, produce something more genuinely worth recognizing. The goal does not disappear. It is liberated from the emotional weight that was making it both desperate and self-defeating. There is a paradox at the heart of all genuine psychological work, and it is worth naming directly. The less you need a particular outcome to resolve your inner world, the more capacity you have to create it in your outer world. The person who must have the relationship to feel whole sabotages the relationship through the very intensity of their need. The person who must have the success to feel worthy makes decisions driven by fear of failure that consistently undermine the success. The person who must have approval to feel safe generates the anxiety that makes them least capable of the authentic presence that earns genuine approval. The shadow, in its disagreement with affirmations, is pointing toward this paradox. It is saying, you cannot get there from here. You have to change where here is. If this video has reached something in you, if there is a recognition beneath the resistance, a tiredness with the performance of positivity, a quiet suspicion that something deeper is required, then you are already at the threshold of the real work, not the work of thinking better thoughts. The work of knowing yourself more completely, of descending into what has been avoided and finding, as everyone who has made that descent eventually finds, that what lived in the darkness was not the monster you feared, but a part of yourself that had been waiting, with extraordinary patience, to finally be brought home. You were never broken. You were never failing. You were simply working with a map that did not go deep enough. This channel exists for people who are ready to draw a new one. Steady. The conversation is just beginning.